bells. When the train comes to please stop.
Your favorite amusement park? Most of us can. Whether we're 10, 40, or 80, chances are that if you just hear the words amusement park, your thoughts immediately drift back to anything from a lazy afternoon of picnicking to an exhilarating day of thrill rides. But whatever the memory, it's for sure we all have at least one. So what is it about these places that make them stick in our collective memories from childhood through old age? The answer is who knows. There could be a million reasons, or maybe just one. They made you feel good. Whatever your reasons and whatever park you remember, two things are for sure. It's almost certain that your park had a humble beginning and a local resident through pure tenacity made it come to life. This is the story of some of those parks and some of the people who created them. And while we may not touch on your favorite, if you look closely, you will see a part of every park in our country. For this is truly an American story. So our journey begins in America of the 1890s. At that time, there were absolutely no amusement parks to be found anywhere. But through a series of seemingly unrelated events that began with the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, all that would begin to change.
Chicago, 1893, an exciting place. Progress had shifted into high gear, and new commodities like electric light and motors had changed the lives of its citizens practically overnight. But to showcase just how far Chicago and America had come, and also offer a glimpse of the future, Chicago was about to host the World's Fair. Almost half the population of the United States, over 27 million people, attended that fair during its 6-month run. And as they wandered around the fairgrounds, visitors could marvel at hundreds of new technologies on display, while also being introduced to some crazy new products like the Zipper and Cracker Jacks. English teacher Catherine Lee Bates was so moved by the fair's gleaming white buildings or alabaster cities she saw at the Chicago World's Fair that she wrote a poem expressing her awe of America. That poem was eventually put to music and sung across the country. To run something as large as the World's Fair, thousands of people had to be hired. One such employee was a teenager hired to be a janitor. His name was Fred Thompson, and like everyone else, Fred loved the spectacle that was the World's Fair. He loved the machines, the inventions, the technology, and the lights. Everywhere, lights. But Fred was especially intrigued with the Midway Plaisance, or simply the Midway. This was the area leading up to the fair that hosted acts and exhibits, rides, exotic foods, and sideshows filled with dancers, comedians, jugglers, and freaks. It was put together to create an atmosphere of excitement and fun before you actually got to the fair itself. And the highlight of the Midway was the huge wheel-shaped ride created by George Ferris, and, not surprisingly, named the Ferris wheel.
Shall we make the journey, but by Ferris wheel? Lapland's on the right, love, and while down May, Germany's in sight, love, not a block away.
What was impossible to predict was how this lowly janitor's awe of a Midway in 1893 would eventually help save another World's Fair from failure.
Fred Thompson wasn't the only one inspired by the Chicago World's Fair. This fair planted the seed for a whole new style of recreational park, and many efforts to recreate just a little bit of that magic were just beginning to appear.
Some businessmen got together and bought a deserted site called Euclid Beach, just outside of Cleveland. There they started to lay walkways and put up booths for vendors.
On a remote peninsula in Ohio, a crude roller coaster was built that allowed people to climb up some steps to a hill and then ride down to the bottom.
A woman in Denver named Mary Elitch and her husband opened up her private gardens to the public.
These are some examples of the gardens, picnic areas, and beaches that were popping up all over the country. Most of them lasted only a few short years and then disappeared as the hype from the Chicago World's Fair faded away. Eventually, Fred Thompson's job with the Chicago World's Fair ended, but the dream he took with him from Chicago certainly hadn't. As a self-described exposition fiend, he involved himself in every American exposition for the rest of the century. So it was only logical after several years that he was awarded the contract to construct the Midway for the 1901 Buffalo World's Fair in Buffalo, New York. Fred Thompson, then only 26, was poised to make a name for himself in fair history.
The advertisements called the Buffalo World's Fair a colossal university. It was a fair meant to educate people. Of course, there was one small problem. It's hard to educate people who don't show up. Apparently, there just weren't that many people who cared to be educated in Buffalo. And the few people who did attend the fair found Fred Thompson's Midway to be the most exciting part. Fred saw the writing on the wall, and as the fair itself was approaching bankruptcy, he proposed an idea to the fair executives. Why not let him create a one-day event dedicated only to fun? He would call it Midway Day and fill the whole fair with jugglers, clowns, musicians, and, most importantly, fun. To say the least, Fred's suggestion was met with more than a tiny bit of skepticism. Or, in other words, they hated it. Not willing to take no for an answer, Fred approached the president of the fair, telling him that he should give his Midway Day a shot because, well, honestly, what did he have to lose? Midway Day finally arrived, and Fred Thompson stood in shocked silence when the park opened and the entrance gates remained empty. Fred knew he couldn't have misjudged what the people wanted this badly, could he? Of course, what Fred couldn't have known was that all the people trying to get to Midway Day had completely overwhelmed the train system. But once the trains were up and running, the fair was soon jammed with people. By the end of Midway Day, the crowds had far surpassed even Fred's predictions. After Midway Day, the fair executives turned to the upcoming visit of William McKinley, President of the United States. The president was impressed by the fair's exhibits as he was guided to an auditorium to give a speech.
We hope that all who are represented here may be moved to higher and nobler efforts for their own and the world's good.
When he finished his speech, McKinley was escorted to a reception at the fair's Temple of Music in order to meet some of the park's guests. While shaking hands, a man stepped forward, hand wrapped in a handkerchief, and fired 2 shots at the president, mortally wounding him. McKinley was rushed to a house on the fairgrounds so doctors could attend to him right away. For 8 days he clung to life, but eventually infection set in, and President McKinley clutched one of the doctors and said a line from his favorite song, "Nearer, my God, to thee." He then passed away, still in Buffalo and still at the fair. vice president was summoned from a hiking trip and sworn in as the 26th president. Teddy Roosevelt would become the youngest man ever to take office, and with his youth, he brought a new vitality to the nation.
Since play is a fundamental need, playgrounds should be provided for every child, as much as schools. I want you to make up your minds that you are going to have a good time as long as you live.
The Chicago World's Fair revealed that technology for amusement rides was available. Fred Thompson turned the Midway into something that could attract all Americans. And with Teddy Roosevelt's decree that it was not only acceptable, but our right to play, well, apparently the stage was set for a new era in American life. It was then that Fred Thompson packed his bags for New York City with big plans for a small beach known as Coney Island. But New York wouldn't be the only place where the need for play was starting to catch on. How about we check in and see what was going on in other parts of the country?
Well there, excuse me. Well, here in the valley, we heard about all the goings-on at the World's Fair. But life's a lot different here. What you got in these parts are pretty much hard-working, religious folks, farmers, coal miners, and the like. But you know, sometimes you just need to take a break and have some fun. Why, even Mr. Teddy Roosevelt said that it was important for us all to play sometimes. And what most people around here really liked doing was going over to Henry Knoebels' place after church, changing into some old clothes, and then jumping off the old covered bridge into his creek. And while we're all having a good time jumping and swimming and such, Henry and his boys would brush, water, and feed our horses for 2 bits, what you might call a quarter. Anyway, I'm guessing that all those quarters must have added up pretty fast, because soon Henry was able to build a small dam and made the swimming hole bigger. And then, after a bit more, Henry had some fella set up a carousel. Can you believe it? We had our very own carousel, right there, in the valley.
And whether they knew it or not, while they were relaxing under that rickety old covered bridge, in another part of Pennsylvania, out by Pittsburgh, Andy McSwiggan was kind of doing the same thing.
Andy McSwiggan followed Teddy Roosevelt's advice and built himself a park with picnic grounds on the side of the Appalachian Mountains where the views of the factories could really be enjoyed. Well, at least enjoying the fact that you weren't working. But Andy wasn't someone who simply enjoyed nature. He was also a man who loved adventure. So he added a few exciting thingamabobs to bring people to his picnic grounds. Some of these contraptions slid people down the mountains and hoisted them back to the top, while others took guests on a romantic boat ride through some long, dark tunnels.
Henry Knoebels Park and Kennywood were both in Pennsylvania, but created by two very different men. One was a place to picnic and relax, while the other was a place to picnic and, well, not relax. Still, both reflected the personalities of their creators. There were some parks across the country, however, they more reflected the personality of their cities. And unfortunately, that wasn't always a plus.
I think it is safe to say at the turn of the 20th century, Cleveland was perhaps not one of America's prettier cities. The constant black smoke spewing from the smokestacks of the city's steel mills had a lot to say about that. The men who worked these steel mills were, not surprisingly, very similar in spirit to their working environments. Simply put, they were a rather hard lot. So, when President Roosevelt suggested that Americans should pay more attention to play, The ones that realized we had a president obliged, but took his advice to a much different level. For when they accordingly played hard. Thus it came as a shock to no one that the midway at a local park called Euclid Beach Park wound up being filled with gambling stands, freak shows, rowdiness, and extensive public drinking. However, there was one young vendor at Euclid Beach, Mr. Dudley Humphrey, who eventually did reject the raucous atmosphere in which he was forced to sell his popcorn balls. He finally decided to move his business out of the Midway to what he considered a more respectable downtown location.
And while Dudley Humphrey was making this move in Cleveland, on Coney Island, Fred Thompson was making history.
It had taken 2 years, but there was Fred Thompson standing outside his park the night before it opened. Sure, there were other parks on Coney Island, but this one was going to be different because it was going to be the best. Fred called it the biggest playground on earth, and all it would take to prove him right was to open the gates. As the people entered the next day, no one could believe what they were seeing. There were over 200,000 lights outlining every building. The rides were state-of-the-art and traveled at speeds approaching 8 miles an hour. And the Midway? Well, it was definitely a Fred Thompson Midway, and the best he had ever created to boot. Thompson described his park simply as movement, movement, movement everywhere. And, like Luna's namesake, the moon, this park would have many phases and would be different every night.
I've made my plans for the summer. I'm dreaming of happy days when I'll hear the roll of the drummer, the music the big band plays, with wooing and cooing at twilight and shooting the chutes after dark. From me to you, that is what I'll do down at Luna Park.
And boy, did the crowds come pouring in. At a time when the average worker made less than $1 a day, Fred Thompson's Luna Park soon boasted profits measuring in the millions. By the time a year had passed, Luna Park had completely paid for itself. What Fred had envisioned was people coming to a place that was full of dazzle, spectacle, and excitement. In contrast to that of the average tenement life, Luna Park offered an escape to such a place where all the senses could be stimulated and one could forget, if only for a short time, the daily life outside its gates.
Down at Luna Park, down at Luna Park.
Fred Thompson had created the first true American amusement park. He had figured out what the people wanted, or maybe more importantly, what the people needed, and gave it to them. And just as Thompson predicted, news of Luna Park spread across the nation like wildfire. Only trouble was, a trip to Luna Park for anyone outside of New York City was pretty much out of the question. To fill that void, imitation Luna Parks, and a lot of them with the exact same name, started popping up all across the country. Within 3 years, there were 400 amusement parks in the United States. The amusement park as we know it was born almost overnight.
In downtown Cleveland, Dudley Humphrey's popcorn business had started to prosper, and as fate would have it, Euclid Beach Park was put up for sale about the same time. Though he had left Euclid Beach feeling it was beneath his standards, Humphrey decided he would nonetheless buy the property and reinvent it. So he bought Euclid Beach, closed all the unseemly attractions, and set out to fashion his vision. When Euclid Beach reopened, it was with a strict code for dress and behavior. Quite simply, it was now a place of refinement and class, and nothing could have signaled this more than the splendor of the light-covered castle, which was the entrance to the park, or the racing horses, a carousel where the horses seemed to compete against each other as they gently circled around. And because of its beauty, elegance, and atmosphere, in a relatively short amount of time, Euclid Beach Park became a shining jewel in the not-so-refined city of Cleveland.
Euclid Beach had also become one of the premier parks in the country.
Euclid Beach was known for staging many special events, such as musical shows or even the high-flying event that saw a young pilot take off from the park in an attempt to break the world's record for the longest flight completely over water. This would be accomplished by flying from Euclid Beach Park to Cedar Point, another amusement park halfway between Cleveland and Detroit. On the day of the event, the lone pilot took off from Euclid Beach in a single-engine plane with only a compass and his eyes to guide him.
Cedar Point, that's the place.
The pilot finally spotted what he was looking for, the small peninsula in the middle of nowhere called Cedar Point. The first thing that the pilot probably noticed when he looked around was that Cedar Point was no Euclid Beach. In fact, at the time, it was little more than a large hotel with a beach for swimming and boating.
Oh yeah, there were big parks, little parks, and everything in between. Even way out in Denver, things were starting to develop. A young woman named Mary Elitch, along with her husband John, ran a restaurant that catered to miners and travelers.
The restaurant was widely known and respected, but it could not grow where it was first built. To remedy that, John Elitch purchased a plot of land just outside of town so he and his wife could build anew and expand their business. But what was even more important to Mary was that she now had enough land to plant some manicured gardens where the customers could stroll after enjoying their meals. In time, her little gardens turned into a magnificent floral and topiary display. So much so that not only did her patrons stroll the gardens after dinner, they started carrying food from the restaurant so they could picnic in the park. Mary Elitch adopted circus animals and incorporated them into what would be Denver's first zoo. What had started out as a simple restaurant had now grown into a combination restaurant/garden/picnic ground/theater/zoo. Sadly, just after the zoo's opening, John Elitch died, leaving Mary to run this conglomeration of attractions all by herself. That's right, a woman in the late 1800s was running a park by herself.
Sequestered away in Denver, there was one facet of the park business that Mary Elitch certainly didn't have to deal with, and that was the competition. Of course, the same couldn't be said in the Cleveland area, where Dudley Humphrey's Euclid Beach was the favorite park, and apparently no one could do anything about that. Euclid Beach had become so successful, it was now draining business from all the smaller parks. A lot of that had to do with the fact that the trolleys and railroads could now take people to the destination of their choices. One such park outside of Cleveland, Chippewa Lake, was struggling to survive. And soon found itself unable to pay its loans. And as is usually the case in situations like that,
the bank foreclosed on it. Chippewa's owner, Mac Beach, was truly devastated, but was convinced he had done everything he could do to make a profit. Of course, opinions do tend to differ, even in the same family. So when Mac Beach's own son, Parker, bought Chippewa Lake Park back from the bank, Mac was sure Parker had just thrown away his $3,500. But Parker Beach was a different sort of park owner. He was everybody's best friend. His social life revolved around groups like the Lions, the JCs, the Kiwanis, and the Rotary. He was one of them, and everybody knew it. Through this network, he was able to convince even the largest of factories and businesses to have their company picnics at Chippewa Lake Park.
While the band plays soft and slow, give me your love a summer night on the Chippewa Lake Waltz.
It seemed that Chippewa had stumbled onto a formula that worked. Of course, they weren't the only ones who had figured out that company picnics meant big profits. Both large and small parks were competing to secure the company picnic, and newspapers started reporting these competitions as if it was major news.
On Akron Picnic Day, there were traffic jams all the way from Akron to Euclid Beach Park, a distance of almost 50 miles.
The Goodyear Local No. 2 United Rubber Workers decided to have their picnic at Chippewa and brought 40,000 employees and family members.
Over 40,000 people came to the annual East Cleveland Community Picnic at Euclid Beach.
10,000 cars were parked for the picnic, and 2 special trains from Akron helped transport picnickers to Chippewa.
Italian Day, sponsored by the Cleveland Federation of Labor at Euclid Beach, attracted 51,000 people.
The Cleveland District Auto Council will hold their annual picnic at Chippewa Lake Park, and all attendance records are expected to be shattered that day.
Goodyear employees and families swelled Euclid Beach's attendance to over 80,000 on their picnic day. The Democratic Party picnic and rally attracted nearly 100,000 to Euclid Beach Park.
Anyone who lived during this time would surely have a story or two to tell you about company picnics. As more and more parks sprang up across America, a pattern started to emerge. As soon as one park appeared to be successful, another one would magically pop up nearby. So it was no surprise when Mary Elitch, who appeared to have Denver all to herself, finally found herself facing some competition. One of Fred Thompson's employees figured he learned about all he could from old Fred. He decided it was time to start his own park. So he traveled to Denver and opened a park just a few blocks away from Elitch Gardens. Unfortunately, what this person never learned from Fred Thompson was how to make a park succeed. In short order, the bank put it in receivership. And it probably would have remained so if not for one of the park's more ambitious concessionaires, Ben Krasner.
Ben now owned an amusement park. Ben created a place for families that was run by a family, his family. Aunts and uncles were operating rides, selling food, and even sweeping up trash. Ben put in a roller coaster. And, of course, a train, simply because he wanted everyone to have fun at Lakeside. But the most important asset Ben felt his park could achieve was an overall family feel, a place where any family would be comfortable. And that's exactly what he got.
Just take a trip out to Lakeside. That is the place to go.
Ben also hired people from all walks of life, from elegant women with long gloves to at-risk youth, kids who were not employable elsewhere. It seemed everyone wanted to work at Lakeside. Many of these employees remained grateful and loyal to Lakeside and Ben for the rest of their lives. For them, Lakeside was and would always be a family.
Back under the old covered bridge at the Knoebels place, the folks continued to come and the park continued to grow. See, the Knoebels family seemed to know exactly what we folks around here wanted. Just a peaceful place to get away from it all. Maybe a place to ride some rides, and most important, a place to picnic.
So picnics were obviously important, and most parks saw them as a big key to their success. But not all parks did.
Luna Park made Fred Thompson a celebrity in New York as a businessman, showman, and playboy. His park reflected this larger-than-life personality, and it was never meant to be a place for picnics. In fact, Luna Park was not even meant to be much of a place for children or families. It was clearly designed for singles and young couples. If a visiting couple did happen to have children, Luna Park had the solution. The park included a nursery service that guaranteed babies no longer a bar to pleasure. You get a check, we do the rest. The bottom line was that Thompson's Park catered to the hip young people of the time. It was a place where men could meet women, or the other way around. He built faster and more daring rides, and it became a place where you would feel as if you were risking your life on seemingly death-defying rides while being advised to keep your hands and feet inside the cars at all times. In other words, this park was quickly becoming a world of risks. Not real risks, mind you, just riskless risks.
And shooting the chutes after dark. From me to you, that is what I'll do down at Luna Park.
Though Luna Park was quite the opposite of what Mary Elitch had created in Denver, she was still a business person. And being such, she knew it was in her best interest to know exactly what the competition was up to, even if that competition was thousands of miles away. So it's not at all that surprising that one sweltering afternoon, Mary Elitch found herself making her way through the crowds in Luna Park.
Mary traveled to New York because she'd heard all the talk about some new figure-eight toboggan ride, one of the first roller coasters, and she wanted to see for herself what all the fuss was about. She boarded the car, and the suspense grew. As she looked down, the people on the ground seemed to get smaller by the second. And then she went down, then up, followed by left to right, then right to up, and left to down. As the car pulled into the station, a man announced, "Welcome back, riders." And with that, it was evident that Mary would no longer just own a garden/restaurant/picnic ground/theater/zoo. She knew now she owned an amusement park. As she got out of the car, she straightened her large Victorian hat, smoothed her dress, and simply stated, "Well, we need to get one of these." That was all it took to transform Elitch Gardens into an amusement park.
As it turned out, it was lucky for Mary that she visited Luna Park when she did.
During Luna's 8th season, a fire swept through, destroying most of the attractions and the scene shops for creating the theatrical productions. Fred Thompson was a good businessman, but he had made what many saw as a real boneheaded mistake. He had never insured his park. After the fire, he was forced to declare bankruptcy and sell what was left of Luna Park. Fred died 4 years later, without even enough money for a headstone. And while there may not have been a stone to mark his grave, there's no doubt that during his life, Fred Thompson himself had left an everlasting mark on all of America.
About the time that Mary Elitch was starting her park in Denver, a young man stepped off the train into that very same city. He was alone, broke, and in desperate need of a job. His name was Milton Hershey.
The only job Milton could find was making caramel in a candy plant. In time, Milton realized that he could not make a real living as a candy maker, so he packed his bags and moved back home. But on the trip from Colorado, Milton decided to make a stop in Chicago. There was a little thing going on there called the Chicago World's Fair, and he wanted to see it. Though he found the whole fair fascinating, the one part that really caught his imagination was watching candy from around the world being made. All the new candy-making machinery he saw truly entranced him. But how the Swiss were apparently using milk to keep their chocolate fresh and tasty, just like he had learned to do with the caramel back in Denver, came as the biggest surprise. As Milton slipped through the crowds, the budding entrepreneur's decision was made. He would start his own candy company. Hershey, Pennsylvania, the chocolate town was born. As his company prospered, so did the town and all of his employees. Yet, no matter how good things were, Milton was always dreaming of how life could be better. Not for him alone, but for the people who worked for him. He could often be seen walking alone in the fields surrounding the town, lost in his thoughts. Perhaps it was one of these walks when he realized one thing his townspeople were really missing. They were missing a place where they could go to escape their everyday routines. What they needed was an amusement park. And being Milton Hershey, he built them one. It was a tranquil place of picnics, but also a place of exhilarating rides. It was a park of many facets, just like the man who created it.
You know, it often boggles the mind just how some things work. Like a candy maker creating a world-famous amusement park. As much success as many of the parks around the country were having, there was one thing that none of them could have ever foreseen or controlled. And that was the Great Depression of the 1930s. This national catastrophe cut deeply into every single park, and many didn't survive. Of those that did emerge from the Depression, many were crippled and in dire need of attention. The once beautifully manicured parks were now showing signs of neglect. Paint faded and peeled from rides, and many of the glamorous lights that used to shine so brightly burned out and were never replaced. By the time the 1940s rolled around, the word that best described most amusement parks was, well, dingy.
When another series of fires leveled Luna Park for a second time in 1944, the park was so old and dilapidated that it was not rebuilt. The park that had started it all. Fred Thompson's biggest playground on earth simply ceased to exist.
But as we left the Great Depression, one man started dreaming just a little differently. He would start imagining a park that was so unique it would threaten every park in America and would one day change the amusement park landscape for the entire world. If you had been one of the earlier park owners, you probably wish you had never heard the name Walt Disney.
Walt Disney boarded the Santa Fe Railway's eastbound Super Chief at the train station in Pasadena, California in 1948.
He was, believe it or not, headed to the exact place Fred Thompson and Milton Hershey had gone over 50 years earlier, the site of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Except now there was only one remaining building, and it was currently the Museum of Science and Industry. The museum was hosting the Chicago Railroad Fair. While on this trip, he would be inspired to design something truly unique.
On Walt's way back to California, he spent much of the time writing about a new form of entertainment he was envisioning, a place he was calling Mickey Mouse Park. By the time he'd gotten off the train, Walt Disney had written the description of a place that was almost identical to present-day Disneyland. Walt described his park like this: The main village, which includes the railroad station, is built around a village green or informal park. In the park will be benches, a bandstand, drinking fountains, trees, and shrubs. We will have a variety of little stores around the park. One will be a toy store. Maybe we could have a magic shop where we would have all kinds of tricks for kids, party favors, etc. Music store. Here the kids can buy the Disney records and all the other kinds of kids' records. The man whom Walt had hired to build Disneyland explained that building real buildings was harder than building movie sets, and their foundations were a must. This man, who constantly had to explain the reality of building a park, was C.V. Wood Jr.
Walt was a dreamer, while C.V., an ex-Army general, had a wild streak and was an excellent engineer. Still, the two of them had a good relationship, despite the fact that they often argued about the direction that Disneyland should go. Walt's eye was always on the detail and the atmosphere needed, while C.V. seemed more concerned with bigger and faster. At first, these disagreements just got lost in the excitement of building the park, but as the park got closer to opening, things changed.
The simple truth was, tensions between C.V. and Walt were escalating, and fast. When opening day finally arrived, the festivities were broadcast live on TV from Disneyland, a very rare event for the time.
While Walt was showing off his new family-friendly park on national television, C.V. was off camera celebrating with his workers, which only added to the speculation that C.V.'s days at Disneyland were numbered. C.V.'s decision to leave Disneyland, coincidentally, came at the exact same time that Walt decided to fire him. Though on his way out, C.V. talked several staff members into leaving with him to build the brand new Magic Mountain Park just outside of Denver.
The news that the former president of Disneyland was coming to build a park in Denver hit Lakeside Park and Elitch Gardens like a brick. Both braced for a devastating blow to their parks because they knew they simply didn't have the resources to compete with a brand new Disneyland-type park in their own backyard.
As it turns out, the plans for Magic Mountain looked very much like Disneyland. The local newspaper covered the daily progress and even the smallest advances, like finishing the foundation for an attraction made front-page news. Then, all of a sudden, nothing. The newspaper coverage just stopped completely. While C.V. understood engineering and design, he most certainly did not understand how to use the media, especially not the way Walt did.
Elitch Gardens and Lakeside never did feel the effects they feared from Magic Mountain. And in just 4 short years, Magic Mountain was bankrupt and out of business. In the end, it came down to the fact that C.V. Wood had set out to build Walt Disney's dream instead of his own. Once their new park folded, the former Disney employees who had come to Denver broke up into 2 groups. One headed to Texas to start a company that would later become Six Flags. The other group, led by C.V., went to Ohio.
Unfortunately, the folks at Lakeside could only relax for a short while. In the middle of one of their busiest seasons, Ben Krasner passed away.
All across the country, it now appeared that the first generation of park owners were all transferring the reins to the next in line.
Parker Beach had done something his father Mac could not. He had turned Chippewa Lake Park into a successful and well-loved amusement park. One day, Mac made a request to Parker. When Mac died, he wanted the lights in the park to stay lit for the entire night. Shortly thereafter, Mac did pass away. Parker let the lights twinkle until dawn and held a silent, solitary vigil to his dad, friend, and business partner.
And all the while, Disneyland seemed unstoppable.
From its opening, Disneyland had been a place where all members of the family could have fun together, which is why Walt was against roller coasters in his park. He was willing, however, to bend his rule just a bit when he conceived the idea for a new attraction. What he had in mind was basically a roller coaster, but what was most important was that it couldn't look like a roller coaster because that would be completely out of place in this world of fantasy. So the ride was hidden inside a man-made mountain. To accommodate the tight turns, Walt's designers invented a tubular metal track that could be easily shaped. The ride wound up as one of many firsts for Disneyland. In this case, the first metal roller coaster built in the world. Not too shabby for a park that didn't even want a roller coaster to begin with.
Walt Disney was so far ahead of everyone else in the park business that it seemed that no one would ever catch up with him, especially not his former partner, C.V. Wood. C.V. knew that after the Magic Mountain disaster in Denver, the offer he got from a group in Ohio was pretty much his last shot. So he agreed to transform the minor Cedar Point amusement park into something major.
Little Cedar Point always lived in the shadows of the massive Euclid Beach Park. It had never grown beyond a local park, and by the 1950s it was old and outdated. So, when some investors purchased it, they figured that there would never be any objection to closing the park and using the land for a housing development. They figured wrong. There was such an outcry from the public, not to mention a petition that was sent to the governor of Ohio to spare the park, that the investors were forced to abandon their demolition plans and instead try and make the old park successful. The problem was, none of them knew anything about building or running a modern amusement park. That's where C.V. Wood came in. C.V. was hired. C.V. loved thrills, so it was only logical he would build Cedar Point to reflect what he believed in. He started investing in the biggest and wildest roller coasters of any park anywhere. Cedar Point's slogan changed from the Disneyland of the Midwest to the roller coaster capital of the world. From then on, C.V. made sure that Cedar Point was always one step ahead of everyone else. If a park had built something faster, steeper, or longer, Cedar Point would respond with a new coaster that would take back the record.
Within a little more than 10 years, Cedar Point had come from nowhere to dwarf a lot of other parks, including Euclid Beach, and was now also getting the kind of national attention that used to be reserved just for Disneyland. And while fortunes were flying high at the roller coaster capital of the world and the happiest place on earth, things were apparently not too sweet in Chocolate Town.
Hershey Park had survived a lot of rough times because it could usually benefit from the vision of Milton Hershey. But Milton had passed away, and the current crisis was the biggest one the company ever had to weather without its founder. Because of an aggressive advertising campaign on the part of rival Mars Chocolate and a major recession, sales at Hershey plummeted 30%, and for the first time in its history, the company reported a loss. Suddenly, the amusement park was looking like a luxury instead of a necessity. If Milton were alive, there would have been no question that the park would survive. But Milton was gone, and times had definitely changed. The park was now outdated, cost a lot to maintain, and the high standards created by Disneyland and Cedar Point made the feasibility of updating the park very unattractive to its executives. All signs seemed to point to the fact that Hershey Park just wasn't going to make it. But in an illogical but very Milton Hershey-type move, management decided to keep the park open, pour as much money into it as they could find or borrow, and try to convert it into a marketing tool for the company. The park was then refurbished, an admission price along with new roller coasters was added, and a simulated tour of the chocolate factory became the main attraction. And just like that, the people started flocking to Hershey Park once again. Even the sales of their chocolate bar increased. Perhaps because people were now looking at the Hershey bar and saying, "Hey, I know where this came from."
Parks that didn't have icons like Mickey Mouse or the Hershey chocolate bar had to rely on the roller coasters even more. And the race was on. When the great roller coaster race took off, it did cost some of the parks a lot, mostly their personalities. Of course, there were some parks that never even felt the necessity to go to the starting line.
At its peak, Euclid Beach was the talk of Cleveland, not to mention the entire amusement park industry. Soon, Euclid Beach had the most advanced rides anyone had ever seen, anywhere. So much so that almost 30 years later, a singing group called, of all things, the Beach Boys, would write a song mentioning the flying turns.
And Euclid Beach on the flying turns, I'll bet you can't keep from smiling.
Dudley Humphrey had created a park with exciting rides balanced perfectly by a world of genteel and proper behavior. Then, as was destined to happen, Dudley Humphrey passed away. Cleveland went into mourning, and Euclid Beach went into the hands of the Humphrey family. Dudley's relatives had been managing the park with him for years and admittedly knew the ins and outs of its day-to-day operations, but what they couldn't recreate on their own was Dudley's innate sense of what people wanted, what gave them the desire to come back to his park again and again.
When the Humphrey family inherited the park, it was so far out in front of the race that staying ahead of the pack shouldn't have been a problem. Yet for some reason, it was.
The last coaster built at Euclid Beach was the Flying Turns in 1931. The Humphrey family added new rides, but they were nothing like the caliber that Dudley had built. What they were adding seemed more on par with traveling carnival rides. Slowly, Euclid Beach's major thrill rides began to pale in comparison with those being built at Cedar Point and other parks. It was obvious the end was slowly coming for Euclid Beach. Its pier, once the pride of all of Cleveland, became shorter and shorter as whole sections fell into the lake due to neglect. The racing horses carousel, Dudley Humphrey's pride and joy, had to be sold to keep the doors of the park open. And in a not too surprising bit of irony, that carousel wound up being sold to Cedar Point. So it should not have been unexpected when the Humphrey family announced that it would be closing its gates forever. Still, the news managed to send a shockwave through most of Cleveland. Those who had not visited Euclid Beach in decades suddenly talked lovingly of their dear park, while those who had been loyal for years reminisced about bygone days. During that final season, the crowds were huge, and it seemed as if the park could survive. But it was more likely that those who came did so to say goodbye to an old friend. Ironically, on its final day, Euclid Beach had to close early due to lack of attendance. In coming months, the park was demolished to make room for a housing development, leaving very little of what was once a prosperous and elegant park. All that remains is the castle entrance to the park, and, a small business that still makes and sells popcorn balls. Ultimately, as the current generation slowly passes away, in all likelihood, so too will the collective memory of the once great Euclid Beach. And this is where the Euclid Beach story ends. When Dudley Humphrey died, he left a park 25 years ahead of its time. When it died, 40 years later, it was a park 15 years behind the competition.
Mary Elitch, the Lady of the Gardens, was growing old, as was her park. The rides had begun to show signs of age. The flowers were starting to overgrow, and the trees had now been providing shade for not one, but multiple generations.
As bills were being forgotten and details overlooked, Mary realized it was time to sell the park she loved so much. She sold it to a local family and insisted on 3 conditions. First, she would be given a permanent box seat in the theater. Second, she could continue to live on the property until her death. And third, the name of the park could never be changed from Elitch Gardens.
This new family operated the park according to Mary's wishes for almost 80 years.
Nearing the end of the 20th century, the owners of Elitch Gardens decided to make a series of remarkably risky decisions. Instead of trying to fix up the old beloved park, they would close it and build a brand new Elitch Gardens from scratch, a modern urban park that was nothing like the one that they were closing. They chose a former train yard in the middle of the industrial area of downtown Denver. The site had been designated a Superfund by the EPA and was so toxic that even weeds wouldn't grow there. The new park consumed every inch of available space, and visitors in line for the roller coaster were forced to stand next to a chain-link fence within inches of the roadway. This also meant that there was absolutely no space anywhere to waste on the flowers and trees that Mary had so adored. In this new, modern Elitch Gardens, the mere concept of picnics was completely rejected. In fact, coolers and picnic baskets were banned from entering the gates.
On opening day, the new owners found themselves waiting in almost an empty park, just as Fred Thompson had done in Buffalo almost 100 years earlier. Unfortunately, this time, the trains weren't running late. This time, there was simply a lack of enthusiasm. And by day's end, less than 40% of the expected crowd showed up. 3 weeks after the park opened, the Denver Post started to publish articles.
Busloads of camp kids who packed sack lunches ate in the parking lot on grassy medians and sidewalks. At the old Elitches, each day was a picnic party. Visitors hauling coolers of food would lunch under towering cottonwoods and maple trees.
It was as if all the local residents who remembered were yelling in unison, "Hey, what happened to our gardens?"
In the acres of baking concrete, families are eating and then entering.
All of Denver seemed to wonder if the Elitch Gardens that they had known, that their parents and grandparents had known, would ever be the same.
This place is only for the tourists. We're locals. They've cut out the picnic areas.
And now, not much remains on the old Elitch Garden site.
They came in, rode some rides, then got a load of the hot dog prices.
The old merry-go-round house.
They regrouped, got stamped, went out to McDonald's, then came back in. But they weren't happy.
Within 2 years of reopening, the new owners were forced to sell the park for millions less than it had cost to build. Exactly 80 years after Mary sold her park, Elitch Gardens would once again change hands. Only this time, there wasn't one speck of the soul that Mary had poured into her original gardens to be seen anywhere. Today, the park is owned by Six Flags and holds the distinction within the company as being one of the least visited Six Flag parks in the country. As As a kind of ghostly reminder, Mary's old theater still stands at its former park site. Boarded up and covered with graffiti, it remains, for many people, the last symbol of a once splendid park. Inside the darkened theater and amongst the ruins, there remains a box seat, still reserved for Mary. Some say that late at night, Mary's ghost still walks the theater, perhaps waiting for a show to start, or more simply, just looking for her park.
The shadows of the new roller coasters at Cedar Point and the sounds of old ones being torn down in Euclid Beach seemed to loom over Chippewa Lake Park. Parker Beach had not joined the coaster race, opting instead to watch it all from the sidelines.
The cares of life you'll soon forget, gray skies will turn to blue. Ballroom lights are turned down low, and I'm so in love with you. So hold me in your arms, sweetheart, while the band plays soft and slow. And give me your love a summer night. And the
But with steel and rubber mills moving out of the Cleveland area, Parker Beach knew that it would take bold moves and gutsy decisions if his park were to survive and flourish.
But Parker was getting too old and tired to compete, and decided to just sell his park. If I were 20 years younger, he lamented, there wouldn't be enough money in this world to buy this land and lake for me.
The new owners had great plans for a new, revitalized park. What they planned looked a lot like Disneyland and Cedar Point, but was unfortunately nothing like the Chippewa Lake people knew. Few of the plans actually materialized, and within just 10 years, the park was completely out of business. The last season of Chippewa Lake Park was not publicly announced, and the following year, it was as if someone had just forgotten to open it back up.
And that was that. No article appeared in any paper saying the park was closed for good. There was no public outcry at its demise. In the end, it was as if no one even noticed or cared. The park stood for years, waiting for someone to simply throw a switch and make the lights and the sounds and aromas return. Tickets remained in the ticket booths, and the Ferris wheel stood motionless. When hearing the news that his park had closed, Parker Beach, who for so many years had been the heart and soul of Chippewa Lake, made a special request of his family. He wanted to be buried in his park. To this day, permission was never granted, and there were no formal papers. But in the park, there is one lone gravestone. As Chippewa Lake Park faded into history, it was once more united with Parker Beach. And as it is wont to do, time slowly took its toll. In the summer, the weeds grew over the rotting picnic tables. In winter, the snow collapsed the roofs of the Midway, and the Ohio rains took care of the rest, rusting even the sturdiest of rides. The park still stands today, but it will never be able to welcome back riders again.
There's nothing like a simple waltz to cheer a heart that's blue.
Come with me to Cedar Point for the day, where all are happy, light-hearted, and gay. There's dancing and bathing and rides for all. Nothing but pleasure from first to last call.
Just take a trip out to Lakeside. That is the place to go. The sights are all pretty. It's Denver's white city with myriads of lights all aglow.
We should buy a ticket to the great World's Fair. Step into the Ferris wheel and travel through the air with winging and cooing at twilight and shooting the chutes after dark. From me to you, that is what I'll do down at Luna Park. Down at Luna